yes, as Asanka mentioned, our panel up next is called It's a Funny World, but No Laughing Matter, a fireside chat that considers global economic outlook, trade and sustainable development, moderated by Daniel Alphonsus. Daniel Alphonsus is the CEO of The Examiner, Sri Lanka's first subscription-based digital newspaper. A Fulbright scholar, he holds degrees from Balliol College, Oxford, and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. His insights blend fintech innovation and deep expertise in public policy. Joining us as speakers for this fireside chat are Dr. Nishan Demel, Leong Zi Han, and Azusa Kubota. Dr. Nishan Demel is an economist with extensive academic, policy, and private sector experience. He taught and researched economics at Oxford and Harvard universities after completing his undergraduate studies at Harvard. His graduate studies at Oxford, where he was a Chevening scholar. Can we get our speakers on stage while I make the introductions? Leong Zi Han is the chairman of the Singapore Professional Center and an alumnus of Harvard University. A financial advisor, author of 4 books, and a widely quoted media commentator, Leong is known for his commentary on social and economic issues, often advocating for more equitable governing policies. Azusa Kubota is the resident representative for the United Nations Development Programme in Sri Lanka. Her leadership is focused on guiding Sri Lanka's recovery towards a sustainable, green, and inclusive future. A scholar of international affairs from Columbia University, she's a strategic and influential speaker on the
but the dawn of the new age is yet to emerge. The certainties of yesteryear, of the last century almost, where we had some sort of equilibrium between the two great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, and then after that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Pax Americana that followed, ushered in a period of stability and in some sense relative certainty that we hadn't seen for some time in the world. That era has frayed and now has largely passed. Also, while this happened in terms of the relations between states and the global economic order that it underpinned, we also have technology changing. That process was co-evolutionary with the rise of radical new technologies like the steamship, gunpowder, railways, telegrams, and microprocessors. Now we have artificial intelligence, which also portends to profoundly shape the world around us. With these two great forces, we do not know the shape, the structure, or character of the future that is to come, but we know that change is upon us. And in that context, we have a very distinguished panel from all parts of Asia with many different backgrounds which have been introduced. But I'll hand it over now to Nishan to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for that introduction of the session. And thank you, Kandeepan and the Harvard Alumni Clubs in Sri Lanka and all over Asia for this wonderful effort in pulling us together and giving us a sort of framework to talk and think and actually decide how we're going to engage the world together. It's a funny world, but no laughing matter. It's titled as Global Economic Outlook, Trade and Sustainable Development. I want to suggest that our panel looks at this question or the panel's discussion in 3 ways. One, that it is perhaps about the ironies of the world we live in. It's a funny world, but no laughing matter. Secondly, that in this context of this ironic world, how do we think about economics and development and the challenges and the solutions? And thirdly, what role might we play in all of this as alumni of Harvard? So I'm going to take that framework and reflect first on the kind of big ironies which we are all familiar with, but perhaps it's also good to remember them. At a time when we have been able to unlock the mysteries of nanoparticles and the furthest reaches of space, we are not able to unlock our collective ability to reduce carbon dioxide emissions enough to prevent the catastrophic overheating of the planet we live in. And you heard a lot about that when Sanjayan spoke, and the risks, and I'm sure Azusa will talk more. At a time when we have been able to produce material outputs at a scale that makes human well-being and flourishing possible in a way that was simply not imaginable even about a generation ago, we find ourselves important to stop people and children being killed and starved to death in Gaza, in Sudan, at a scale that shocks and horrifies the human conscience. Coming closer to home in Sri Lanka, while we are patting ourselves on the back, and we can, for being the poster child of economic recovery after a debt crisis, we have watched and are unable to solve the problem that poverty in this country has more than doubled to around 30% if it is properly measured. It's a funny world, and it's no laughing matter. So it is in this, if I come to my second point about economics, it is in this context that we think about what it means to discuss economics and development. Now, the cacophony in the media is often distracting, and if you listen to it, you will think that the biggest problems of the global economy are the two T's, Trump and tariffs. But the truth is, these are sideshows. The much larger risks that arise for the economics and development are the three P's: poverty, pollution and the sustainability problem, and peace, which disrupts so much of the possibilities of our world. You know, what's really hopeful about Asia right now is the tremendous contribution we have been making with the ASEAN, with China, with India, in uplifting people out of poverty and doing that over long periods of time in a sustained way. Because economics is not about these big numbers that we announce about GDP or how much trade it's happening. Economics is fundamentally about fostering human flourishing. And if we forget that, we forget, because the things we measure are not often the real stuff of what we want to get at. And I can tell you stories about that, but I want to keep it short. And the second most hopeful aspect, I think, in Asia is that we are perhaps less conflict-ridden than most other parts of the world. The Americans and the Europeans are in proxy wars in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and in different parts of the world. And the continent of Africa is conflict-ridden. And Asia perhaps has, not zero, but less conflict and has more ability for peace going forward, if you think about it, than perhaps any other part of the world. So come to my last point, what role might we play as Harvard alumni in all of this? I think, Kandeepan has given us some very important things and ideas to think about, but it simply boils down to this, how we think about the purpose of our education. Education is not designed or delivered to help those who receive it to advance themselves above others. And my field and economists make a huge mistake in evaluating and valuing the benefit of education in the paychecks that you get after you go to the workplace, rather than the way you check in on the world. I mean, nobody who built the great universities of the world, and certainly the founders of Harvard, ever thought that was the purpose of education. The motto of Harvard is veritas, which is truth. They saw themselves as seeking truth. And fundamentally, the purpose of education is to advance truth, to advance justice, and to advance the common good. One of my professors when I was undergraduate at Harvard was John Rawls, and he made this defining thesis of political philosophy in his book, Justice as Fairness, that said nobody deserves to advance themselves above the others unless in doing so they're able to uplift the lives of those who are worse off. Otherwise, society should deny them that upliftment. But we have created a society in which people get an education and the privilege and exploit it for their own advantage. And I want to say that we at Harvard are those who can think and model that differently, and individuals can make a difference. So to give you a couple of examples, I think we've been through crises and difficult situations, and I want to say that sometimes out of the ashes rise the best innovative possibilities and solutions for the world. Muhammad Yunus, who's now the transitional leader of Bangladesh, founded the Grameen Bank on the back of the famine of Bangladesh in 1974 by lending $27. Actually, even before that $27, he just helped a woman who was passing, he met when he was going to university. And he told that story in Oxford once. Today, it has 2,500 plus branches. It has almost 20,000 staff. It works in over 81,000 villages, and there are 8.3 million borrowers with a 97% repayment rate, better than any other bank. Starting with an individual who saw his calling as to respond to a crisis. In Sri Lanka, Daniel's going to stop me very fast. In Sri Lanka, in the middle of our debt crisis, I think Sanjayan talked about Seychelles doing the first, environmental to debt swap. We did the first governance-linked bond in the world. ESG exists without ever being a G bond, and Sri Lanka produced the first ever G bond. So improved governance for debt reduction, and floated it in the middle of a debt crisis. And I feel that students of Harvard, the one thing I learned as I got to Harvard as an undergraduate is that almost everybody I knew was not just distinguished academically, but they had done something remarkable in the world. And I felt, maybe they selected me by mistake. But I think that is the calling of being at Harvard and being a Harvard alumni, that we have been called to use our privilege to foster and catalyze a better world. And I think, if we make that the mission of our community, not to advance our businesses, to make networks, but to come together to find other people who have a similar passion, to say that our education is a privilege, and what we can do with it can revolutionize the world and change the world for the better. And while it desperately needs that, I think that is what it means to be big, bold, and brave. Thank you very much, Danny. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nishan. I'm sure you didn't mean the examiner when you referred to the media cacophony. Next, we have Azusa, who will respond to Nishan's comments. And I'd ask you also to share one idea you have that's big, bold, and brave for this funny world.
I think we could have taken Nishan's speech to the UN General Assembly. So thanks so much for that. So I've been with the UN for 2 decades, and UN has become 80 years old this year. It's a very special, emotional year for all of us. I was thinking about the ironies and no laughing matter issues, right? The irony is that, as you have said, Nishan, UN was created out of the ashes with the hope that we will need a global platform for global common good. And if we look at the issues and challenges we confront today, climate crisis, the previous speaker spoke extensively about, those are transboundary issues that would require nations united. I'm not even talking about conflicts. But when the international platform, multilateralism, is very much needed, we have a culture growing, which is very much founded on zero-sum game. We lose, you lose. So I feel that we are at a crossroads. And when it comes to no laughing matters, the UN has also spearheaded the SDGs, which are embodiment of sustainable development principles. If we look at where we are 5 years, less than 5 years into 2030 mark, globally, 90% of the measurable indicators are off track. If we look at Asia Pacific region, none of the goals will be attained. Where are we? Why are we doing this, right? There's no sense of urgency when it comes to everything being off track. And we can blame on COVID, we can blame on trade wars, but the fact of the matter is 193 nations, leaders signed up to them, and we are critically off track. SDG 13 on climate is actually regressing alarmingly, and we are not hearing much about it. And one of the defining feature in saving this situation is financing, innovative financing. Sanjay spoke a lot about climate-based financing, nature-based financing, but if we can also combine debt swaps, many of the countries in Asia-Pacific region are highly indebted or on the risk of being highly indebted, paying 5 to 7 times more on debt servicing than on climate action, for example. So if we can repurpose them, redirect those resources to SDG-aligned interventions, we can do also wonders. We heard a lot about debt for nature swap. In Sri Lanka, we're discussing the possibility of debt for energy transition swap. It's being explored in Egypt and others. Why not doing that? I think Nishan, you talked about governance-linked bonds. We could do also SDG-aligned orange bonds. There are many, many ideas, and this is really the opportunity for us to take that bold step forward in utilizing this debt crisis as a way to build back better from the economic crisis. And another no laughing matter is that while the world has done very well in lifting people out of poverty in this Asia-Pacific region, over 1 billion people, in a very short span of time. That's very, very impressive. But inequality is growing very fast. 65% of the world population live in countries where inequality is growing. In South Asia region is one of the most unequal. If we look at the ranking of countries in terms of inequality, South Africa is the most unequal, followed by some of the South Asian countries, including Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is one of the most unequal. Top 10% of the wealth, top 10% of the richest own more than 50% of the wealth, right? So this is becoming the trend. So while people are being lifted out of poverty, people's happiness, contentment, well-being, it's not catching up. UNDP did a study 2 years ago, asked people about their sentiment around about their future. 6 out of 7 people said they feel very unsure and uncertain about their future, especially about job losses. And this is also driven by AI and technology, right? It could be a perception. We don't really have hard data as to whether the number of jobs being created is catching up with the number of people who are being displaced. But if we don't really invest in educational system transformation right now, to make sure the young people who come out of universities, over 1.6 billion people come out of education system and enter workforce globally. How do we create those jobs for the young people if we are not preparing them for the uncertain world where the technology is really changing the skills demand landscape the contentment, happiness, the wealth, the happiness indicator of the people will not be matching with the efforts that we are all making. So I just want to say that this is really a moment in history where we have to rethink education, skills requirements, and the match financing, direct financing, available financing to targeted interventions. And as Sanjay said, time to wait for rich nations to pay for poor nations is over. And I feel this every day. ODA is shrinking very rapidly. I'm not sure if this is a temporary thing, thanks to one of the big T's. But unless we work on innovative financing mechanisms that generate domestic resources, including also tax policy reform, and purposely direct those resources to SDG-aligned activities, we won't be able to meet those growing gaps, be it inequality or SDG attainment. So I stop here.
Thank you very much for that view, a view of the whole world, an expansive one, and a view that looked at finance as well. And in that context, we have Leong, who is a finance professional, but also comes from a small state that's navigating this funny world. So, Leong, over to you.
What is not so funny or ironic for many countries today is a story that goes something like this. And I'm going to cite the UK as the classic recent example. In order to win an election, you have to promise more benefits. And so you win, you become the government. In order to pay for the more benefits, you've got to increase taxes. You get a backlash. What do? You try to cut benefits. That's even worse. So what happens at the end of the day? You have bigger budget deficits. You have bigger public debt. Singapore has been described as the economic miracle in modern times. In the Singapore economic model, we have budget surpluses in 4 out of every 5 years. We have one of the lowest external public debt in the world today. So what is the secret to the Singapore economic success model? The conceptualization of many aspects of the model is based on an Islamic finance concept of the sharing economy. Briefly, sharing economy means cooperation and sharing of risk. So in the Singapore model, the responsibility, or some may say the burden of providing benefits for the people is not or does not rest on the shoulder of the state. It is shared between the people and the state. Let me give you the first example. Public housing. Singapore won a UN Habitat Award as one of the best public housing systems in the world. 80% of the population lives in public housing. 80% of those who live in public housing actually own their own public flat. Practically every country, every state, and I've spoken in more than 40 countries on whether the Singapore economic success model can be adapted to that country. Every city, every country has a public housing problem. Fundamentally, the reason is every public house the state sells or builds, they lose money. In the Singapore model, very simple. Every house the state builds or sells, it makes money. The small excess cash flows that are made are utilized to enable the very poor, the very low income to have public housing as well. The maximum grant to help poor and low-income families to own public housing in Singapore is 120,000 Singapore dollars. The cheapest, the smallest public flat you can buy in Singapore is also about $120,000. So if your household income is less than $1,500 a month, you literally can get a public house for free. How do we get the excess cash flows from public housing in order to help the poor and the low income to have public housing? For those who can afford and want to, they can buy a bigger flat in a more popular area. And the excess cash flows can then be used so that the poor and the low income can also have a public flat, but a much smaller one and in a not so popular area. And for those who can't even afford to pay for a public house, public rental in Singapore starts from $20 a month in the most expensive city in the world, according to the economists. Next, let me talk a bit about Singapore's unique pension system. Many countries in the world, and the classic example today is France. If the state is responsible to pay pensions, it is a hole that gets deeper by the day, if not by the year. In the Singapore model, every worker contributes a percentage of his or her income into their own pension account. This pension account, part of it can be used for housing, part of it can be used for education, part of it can be used for healthcare. So here's where is the most crazy part about the Singapore economic model. From a cash flow perspective, the inflows to the state exceeds the outflows every year for areas like public housing, pensions, and healthcare. In other words, the state may not have to spend much money providing public housing, pensions, or healthcare. So how does the pension system work? You contribute to your own account, it's your own money. In the early years of Singapore's economic development, the pension fund was used for economic development, build infrastructure, universities, whatever. In recent years, the pension fund is invested domestically and internationally. The returns are returned to the pension fund members, but the state keeps a small portion of the returns. So after 60 years, these small returns that the state has been keeping year after year, investing, as well as other sources of revenue, now make Singapore the country with the highest reserves per capita in the world. We have more than $2 trillion in the reserve. I have 1 more minute. Okay. Many of you that I spoke to these few days mentioned that jobs is a big problem where you come from. So I'm going to spend my last minute on Singapore's job creation success model. We are one of the most open countries in the world for immigration. About 58% of the workforce are non-native Singaporeans. On a per capita income basis, Singapore is number 2 in the world for the highest per capita income in the world today. Unemployment rate is almost forever at 2%. How do we achieve all this? I don't have enough to say because it's probably left 30 seconds. My big bold brave for Sri Lanka is, in preparation for my speech today, I wrote an ebook, How to Adapt the Singapore Economic Model to Sri Lanka, which I will momentarily post on the BBP chat group. Thank you.
So other than geopolitics and technology, the 2 other great factors that drive humanity are competition and collaboration. throughout these panel discussions and Sanjay's talk earlier, we are seeing an increasingly zero-sum view of the world. In that context, Nishan, and in a context where Sri Lanka has had a very zero-sum view of economics and politics, what role do you think, in terms of education and purpose, we have to play in that world?
Thank you, Daniel. Great question, because economists are very much into this question about what is zero sum, okay? Daniel, I think there are three things. One, that there is a specification problem in what you're saying. What do you mean by zero sum? Secondly, there is this, what is the solution space for this problem, and what are some of the other problems that are not necessarily, that make it difficult to solve the zero sum? If I go quickly, you're all familiar, because most of you are Harvard grads, with the prisoner's dilemma, right? So I won't explain it. Basically, when you think it's zero sum, that you have actually a dominant incentive not to cooperate but to cheat, and it is correct, it turns out that cooperation is still the better strategy. So to act like it is not zero sum. Most of the problems in the world are better solved by recognizing the prisoner's dilemma nature of the choice space that we have. And I think that's also part of education, right? The person or the decision makers and the politicians who are educated in the prisoner's dilemma structure of the choices they face, whether it is to reduce pollution and cooperate in that endeavor, whether it is to, avoid violent conflict and forge a compromise of peace, and whether it is to respond to the tariffs of Donald Trump. Now, I wrote an article that every Indian newspaper refused to publish, arguing that India should not go it alone in negotiating with Donald Trump, that this is a zero sum, this is a prisoner's dilemma. This game had a prisoner's dilemma structure, that the US's ability to bully the world existed only because each person in the world acted as if they were bilaterally negotiating with the US, whereas if they negotiated collectively, they would all win in a cooperation strategy, and they would all stand to lose in a non-cooperative strategy. Now, it's only after India got slapped with high tariffs that Indian institutes came back and said, okay, can we put out a statement using what you have written? And they did. But once again, it was a failure of imagination and understanding that these problems, and it's the same with the war in Ukraine. It is same with the competition between United States and China. We have misunderstood what is a prisoner's dilemma problem and a repeat game prisoner's dilemma, actually, to a one-shot zero-sum game. And so it's actually a kind of a thinking mistake, which makes it really hopeful that by teaching, educating, and showing the way, we have the capacity to change some of those dynamics. I'll end fast, Daniel. I think the real problems in this world are not that they're zero-sum, and we can solve it by creatively demonstrating that they're not. But there are two other problems that are really biting at us, which are deeper solutions. One is, people say, and the Oxford Dictionary, to its shame, added a word to the English lexicon called post-truth society. Have you met anyone who says, I don't care about the truth? I haven't. We live rather in a post-trust society, and that looks a lot like post-truth when it plays out. We have a crisis of how to create centers and institutions and places of trust around which people can collaborate. Collaboration requires trust. It can't work just on punishment. It unravels too fast, even in a repeat game. So really building the capacity for trust is critical. The second is we discount the future too much. We live in an increasingly impatient world. And perhaps the spirituality of Asia is needed, right? Where we have to be able to displace the interests of mine here and now to the interests of my own future, as well as the interests of others. So being able to actually not be so self and moment-centered is a critical problem, because we are teaching the world and we are educating the world to miss that value and kind of essential element for success for humans or civilization and society. I don't want to go on too long, but just to mark out what Daniel says in a different way.
Leon, you're somebody who's worn many hats and engaged in both competitive processes like elections, but also in very collaborative things. And Singapore, as a country, has also, I think, played a similar role in the world stage. Any thoughts?
The most important thought I didn't have time to talk about. A key component to adapting the Singapore model is to eradicate corruption. So I'm going to speak briefly about the Singapore anti-corruption success model. 3 things you must do to get rid of corruption. Number 1, very easy to get caught. We had an 800 line. Anyone can call and say, oh, I think Daniel is corrupt. But if you maliciously, falsely accuse a person, you will get into trouble as well. The propaganda in the early years of Singapore was tremendous. You're watching the television like YouTube, the ad comes out, report corruption. There was even this rumor that the son reported the father for corruption. Right? So very easy to get caught. Second component, the penalty must be very severe. The first minister who was caught corrupt, we asked him to hang himself and he did. And so the message was sent to everybody. Corruption means 20 years in jail. If you give me $100, or I give you $100, we take $100, both of us go to jail for 6 months today. Last year, a cabinet minister was jailed 1 year for corruption. You know what was the things that he was charged with corruption? Cheap wine, $100 friends gave to him. Football tickets, friends gave to him. Theater tickets, friends gave to him. The largest item of his corruption was a free flight on a private jet to Dubai to attend an event, and he was the minister in charge of that event in Singapore. So every once in a while, we have to use the propaganda to send a message to the people. We are very serious about corruption. The third point is a bit more difficult and takes a longer time. You see, in many countries, especially Singapore in the 60s, civil servants cannot survive without corruption. And so we talk to the civil servants. What are your financial concerns? What are your financial goals? The first thing most people say is, oh, I'm worried about healthcare. Okay, free healthcare for all civil servants. Next, oh, I need a home, a roof. Okay, low-cost public housing, which I mentioned earlier, not just for civil servants, but the entire population. Next, oh, retirement. Okay, we will give you a pension for all civil servants. But as it turned out, I was civil myself. Almost all the civil servants, when they were offered for conversion into the pension scheme that all the ordinary citizens are on now, most of us opted in. And you know why? In order to get a pension as a civil servant, you have to work under 55, and if you stop work for any reason, that's gone. So at the end of the day, it really didn't cost the government much money to provide pension for all civil servants, free healthcare for all civil servants, and low-cost public housing for civil servants. I know Daniel is going to say I have another minute or so. So I'm going to take this minute to talk about our unique healthcare system. Because the inflows to the healthcare system also exceeds the outflows every year. In other words, we have the most sustainable healthcare system in the world because the state doesn't need to spend much money. So how does it work? If you go to a public hospital in Singapore, you can choose. You can stay in a room by yourself, 2 to a room, 4 to a room, 6 to a room. Okay? You can choose whether you want to be assigned a doctor at random, or you can choose your own doctor that you like. And if you take the more expensive rooms, your treatment is faster. If you take the cheaper room, you have to wait longer to get treatment. But of course, if it's an emergency and urgent treatment, whether you are in the low class or the high class, everybody gets the same treatment. Thank you.
Azusa, you have been at the forefront of trying to get the world to collaborate on some of our deepest issues in development. In light of what's happening in the world today, how do we have to change the way we collaborate over the next couple of decades?
Just wanted to build on to panel members. So I think we're in a world of trust deficit at all levels, right? How do we rebuild that trust, particularly in institutions? If 90% of the SDGs are off track, which was a social contract between the leaders and the people at all levels, how do we rebuild that trust that's basically eroding very fast? And I want to also build on this point about corruption. I really have to give credit to the Sri Lankan government, which is going decisively at fighting corruption. We have various studies that show that corruption actually leads to economic loss, so I won't go into that. But for South Asian countries, we have done studies using AI, analyzing all the government policies, data across. And we wanted to know which goal would actually unlock other SDG goals. For South Asia, and particularly for Sri Lanka, it was decisively SDG 16, which was about accountable, transparent institutions. So if we can tackle corruption, other SDGs will be unlocked. So it's so important to have good governance. Sri Lanka is also one of the pioneering countries that have published tax perception survey, which is very bold and brave, given that the tax to GDP ratio was very low, and that called for IMF program intervention, right? But the study clearly said that it's not that people are not willing to pay taxes. People are not genuinely trying to evade, tax payments. They are willing to pay if two conditions are met. One is that the rich people who are not paying, they must be held accountable and they better pay. Corruption issue, right? And the second is they want to know how their taxes are used. Very simple. They want transparency in the use of taxes. If these, the cycle of feeding back into the people and engage people in that planning, execution, and reporting back cycle, they are willing to pay and they are willing to be part of this sustainable development pathways. So again, this is a time for us to invest in mechanisms and initiatives that would build back the trust of the people in institutions. And also this is time to redefine the paradigm of sustainable development. When we talk about sustainable development, we're not just talking about the planet and the green and blue things. We're talking about equity, we're talking about inclusivity, and it is a fact that many people are being left behind. In order to achieve gender equality, unfortunately, it would take 300 more years. It's not in a lifetime. How sad is that? And I was serving in Bhutan before coming here. You talked about the spirituality of development, and I had lived through it. It was an incredibly rich experience. Bhutanese leadership has said that growth development is not only about GDP. And we work with Oxford University and the government to define the pillars of gross national happiness. And this happiness is not happiness, ha ha ha, right? It's about contentment. And if you look at economy growing, GDP growing, poverty reducing. But if people are not feeling good about their present and future, what's the point, right? And this is really the developmental dilemma we're having. There is clear correlation between the age of children having access to mobile phones and internet and the rate of depression and suicides. So we have to make a decision. Do we give children access to mobile phones and AI at the early age, right? Or do we accept the fact that we might be AI left behind? But those are the dilemmas that the many governments around the world are grappling with, right? So in a way, we are at a crossroad. We have to redefine the paradigm of sustainable development together. And I think there is a definition that works for the people of Sri Lanka. And for that, people have to be part of that dialogue.
Thank you. This conference is big, bold, and brave. And as Chairman Mao said, revolution is not a dinner party, but lunch is important. And unfortunately, because we're running a little bit behind schedule, we won't have time for any questions, but I'd like to thank Leong Tse-Hien, Azusa Kubota, Nishan Demel for a fantastic panel, and to the audience. Thank you very much.
We have some gifts coming, and I wanted to invite somebody who flew very far, my friend Jarek, to come on stage and hand over these gifts. He came from Warsaw, Poland, and also he paid me anti-corruption. So thank you very much, Jarek, for coming. Please hand these wonderful gifts to our panelists.